Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. So grateful today that we have a chance to welcome Dr. John Ortberg as our guest on Conversing. John Ortberg is a person that many people listening to this program will be familiar with. He's had a long writing history and has been a speaker in so many different conferences, it would be hard to list them all. He's a person that has brought his faith to questions of spiritual formation primarily, and that has really been his primary writing field. He's drawn a great deal from the writing and work of Dallas Willard, and the books that he's written likewise on spiritual formation and transformation. John was the senior pastor at the Menlo Park Presbyterian Church from 2003 to 2020, and his teaching there and in other conferences all around the country and internationally is teaching that has been greatly beneficial. He combines this ability to both speak tangibly and concretely to ideas as well as to experience, to relationships, and most fundamentally to the question of how God and human beings share life together and live it in a way that can be so transformative. John is someone who was educated at Wheaton College, Fuller Seminary, both in theology and in psychology, and is a person that has been an ordained pastor for many years. I'm honored and delighted that he's also served as one of Fuller Seminary's trustees. What a gift it is to be able to welcome him today because of his new book, Steps, A Guide to Transforming Your Life When Willpower Isn't Enough. John, it's so great to have you on the podcast.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. And anybody who is watching as well as listening will understand this. I want to compliment you on your shirt and your eyeglasses and your hair color. Your sense of style is just phenomenal, and obviously has impacted me in very deep ways.
Yes, exactly. I can see that now.
It's quite striking.
John, it's really fun to get to have this conversation with you. And it's fun partly because this book is one of many books that you've written, many bestsellers, books that have made a significant difference in the lives of thousands and thousands of people. But I have to say that this book, it feels to me, touches on a lot of nerve endings that are part of the longer arc of the story that is John Ortberg and the story that is your public ministry. The themes that are here are ones that are not brand new by any means to people who have followed your writing. And yet they gather up in one particular place, a really magnificent constellation of your convictions, your hilarity as always, and your insight into the things that we as human beings need to hear and need to understand. So I'm really thrilled to have the conversation and to be able to focus on this newest book, Steps, A Guide to Transforming Your Life When Willpower Isn't Enough. Let's just start with that subtitle, When Willpower Isn't Enough. What is that about?
Yeah, there's all kinds of work and controversy in our day about the nature of will, the existence of will, the role of will. Dallas Willard, who is a person who has influenced many folks, including myself, in his book, Renovation of the Heart, says that to understand anything, you have to understand, it's always a matter of understanding what are parts, and what properties does each part have, and what functions are involved in those properties, and then how do they fit together to form larger parts. So if you want to understand a car or an economy, anything, there's always that framework, including, of course, persons. And one of the great ironies, most of my background educationally was in psychology, is if you ask psychologists, what are the essential parts of a person, there is no consensus about that. So that's part of what's interesting when it comes to social sciences in particular. And the primary disputed part would be the will, the ability to choose, to say yes or no, to create. It's a very central, I think, and historically in the church has been understood by, classical Greek and Roman thinkers. That was understood to be essential to personhood. And so we all have a will. We're all able to do that. But our wills, although they're very important, are also, in one sense, terrifically weak. And they are good at making big binding decisions, getting married, going to Fuller Seminary, taking a particular job. They are very bad at overriding the attitudes or habits that become embodied in us. So habit eats willpower for breakfast is one way of talking about that. And so I would say there are certain of my Reformed friends that might disagree with this, but I would say there are a number of things that we're able to do through willpower. We're actually able to choose. I can make a phone call. I can drive someplace. However, when it comes to those deeper dynamics in human life, those deeper elements, and how do I deal particularly with my sinfulness, my brokenness, however we want to describe that, my problems with anger, with ego. And so willpower is woefully weak. And pretty much all folks who would seek to be or call themselves Christians or followers of Jesus would agree together with that. And I think most human beings in general would. That cry of Paul, why do I do what I don't want to do? Why do I not do what I want to do? That's just part of the human condition.
Right, right. When my brother and I were little, we used to egg each other on toward various goals. And one of the things that we used to say is, well, if we just really try, and, we would try to outdo one another in the statement of how many reallys were going to be involved in such trying. And, when you're little boys, there's probably enough things that you could actually will yourself to do.
Yeah.
But as you say, as life thickens and gets more and more complex and we become less and less known to ourselves and ever more a mystery to ourselves, which I think is part of the journey of adulthood, we do run into places where the will is simply inadequate. And I think for a lot of people, that is one of the great mysteries because it's itself, like right at the start, where the book is really your particular treatment of the 12 steps, beautifully redone in your own language, your own layering, which I want to just really strongly affirm. And we'll come to explore that in a bit.
Can I just say, Mark, I wish I was as smart as you make me sound when you talk about what it is that I write and say. I need to get like a Mark chatbot and just run everything through that grid. I just a little too pleased by how good it sounds. I just have to acknowledge that for reality's sake. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm right and you're wrong about that, but
I have no doubt.
Well, I'll take it as you offer it. I mean, what is it that causes a person in the most essential way to actually face that the will is inadequate? I just think that's part of why many people don't enter into 12 steps or other kinds of exercises in growth. For folks who are listening to us that may not be real familiar with them, the first step is we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, fill in the blank, and our life had become unmanageable. And there'll often be conversations about addiction and what exactly is an addiction, what's the dividing line between something that is and is not an addiction. And oddly enough, that question is not hugely interesting to me and not really why I wrote the book. What was interesting is that here was a way of life, and it happens that people who clearly do wrestle with an addiction stumbled into it and discovered through this way of life, they were able, as a matter of empirical reality, to receive power to liberate them from something that clearly willpower itself could not. And they were given, as most folks know, in AA or 12 steps, they have a million sticky sayings for everything, much like Jesus did. And I think for a similar reason, because life, death, heaven, and hell is kind of at stake. So they will often talk about the gift of desperation, G-O-D. And it seems to be the case, certainly it was discovered to be the case amongst addicts, that actually the more deeply and intensely you experience the reality of powerlessness and unmanageability,
the more likely you are to let go of. And it's a moment of great despair. The first step is a deeply despairing step. I can't. And it feels to people who are going through it initially like it's just hell and death. And that has a way of opening people up to God and the presence of God and saying, oh, if there is hope there, I will do anything. I will give up anything. I will try anything. They are willing to devote themselves with a kind of intensity that's not self-conscious or self-congratulatory or, look at me. It just flows out of that intense awareness of need in a way that opens the doors for spiritual power to flow.
Right.
And one of the guys that I talked to who's been working in 12-step communities for many decades told me he would not be a professing Christian. He said he regards the 12 steps as a wisdom tradition.
Uh-huh.
And he said the problem with most wisdom traditions is they have a wimpy step 1. And if you have a wimpy step 1, he said, you will have a wimpy steps 2 through 12.
Right.
Or however many steps there are on your program.
Right.
We all got a program.
Right.
And it was very striking to me. I'd never thought about it that way. Then you think about Jesus and his life or his teachings, how often you get 2 characters, one of whom has a robust step 1 and one has a wimpy step 1.
Right.
So the prodigal son, eating out of a pig trough, elder brother, I've been serving my father all these years, I'm doing pretty good. Pharisee and the tax collector, Pharisee, I'm doing pretty good, fast twice a week. Thank God I'm not like those other people. The tax collector beat his breast, would not look towards heaven. Simon and the sinful woman, she's weeping at Jesus' feet. Simon's, why is he after? Over and over and over again, the woman caught in adultery and the guys that are ready to stone her. You see this contrast in stories about Jesus and stories told by Jesus. And time after time after time, it's exactly what this guy is saying. People who have a real robust step 1, there's an openness to God. Somehow it penetrates our defenses and breaks us in ways that are like breaking hard soil to take on a seed. And where we don't have that real honest, deep, unforced, intense step 1, it's just harder.
Right, right. It's something that we share, that we've both had the privilege of being pastors of congregations we've loved and people of so many different kinds that have been part of congregations that we've served. And yet it would be hard as a group to define it as a community of desperation. That's almost exactly what the church tries to present itself as not being.
Yes.
Now, it's an easy thing to take a big and powerful broad shot at the church that just says therefore it's a community of hypocrisy. That's unfair. That is not actually the case. I think there's plenty of honesty, but there is not desperation. And even when there's honesty, the difference between honesty and desperation are 2, again, very different things. Just talk about that for a minute, because they are really, really different.
Yeah, no, I mean, Mark, you put your finger on what in some ways is the most difficult challenge of trying to apply or learn from the wisdom of the 12 steps in the church setting. Because, lots of folks in our day are talking about a rule of life or a discipleship pathway or whatever kind of language that you want to use for it. What's interesting with the 12 steps is it's not rocket science. It's the same. It's coming to believe, surrendering to God, doing serious self-examination, confessing in a deeply honest way to another person, asking for God's help, seeking to improve our conscious contact with God through prayer, meditating on Scripture, offering our life in serving and witness and so on. So it's like the practices themselves are not rocket science. People have been doing them. What happens here is you have a group of people who do them with intensity because of their desperation to avoid hell and death. And it's striking that it seems like, you would know better than me, but it seems like in general, discipleship to Jesus has the most transforming power to people in desperate straits. So in prison, I was just in Angola prison a little over a month ago. And when you see guys in prison, we started out in death row, where they turn to Jesus. It is such a clear, compelling, separate path to take than the path that they had known before, that there are, just unbelievable stories of transformation. or often with the poor, or in the persecuted church, or we'll experience in pastoral ministry sometimes somebody that goes through a divorce or gets a terminal diagnosis, or desperation really is a gift. And one of the things that's frustrating to me, I don't know if it ever was for you as a pastor, but it always felt like, because I have been so gripped by the vision of spiritual transformation and wisdom around that, that I've wanted to try to help make it a practical reality in churches. But I found it much easier to teach about it than to actually have it implemented into church life, where we're just regularly producing more joyful, more faithful, more truthful, more courageous people.
Right.
And I still feel the pain and frustration of that. I do think part of it is we're just not able to reduce it to a formula or put it under human control. And that's probably a good thing. Probably if we could, we would misuse it or turn it into cults or do something to mess it up. So while I'm frustrated at my own lack of ability to do that or to have done that, I'm also aware that there's probably ways in which God needs to reserve the freedom to allow that to happen in certain times and places where it will be helpful.
Right. I have just recently been in conversation with several families whose circumstances involve younger but adult children, 20s and early 30s, who are facing addiction issues. And in two cases, there's a continuing inability to come to the end of themselves. And in one case, there's been a capacity to come to the end of themselves and, in desperation, through the 12 steps, find extraordinary help and relief in being able to make their way to a new path and a new hope. And the parents of the two young adults who are not yet there are really praying for, in a way, I don't think they use this word, but in certain ways, I think they're praying for desperation to arrive, feeling like they really do have to come to the end of themselves and realize that they can't just will themselves beyond the circumstances. They might consider their life terrible right now and be unflinching in the honesty of describing how just awful they think life actually is. But they haven't taken another step toward saying, I'm really at the end of any hope of resolving this under my own agency again, back to what we were talking about initially. I do think that one of the things about being a pastor that has put me in touch with this, as I'm sure it did with you, is actually being with people in death and being with people in birth.
Yeah.
And in both cases, realizing that something is truly, life is itself actually on the line.
Yeah.
And whatever else may also have been true for them, this is now an impending reality in a way that they've never really understood before. And the closest thing to that, besides birth and death, are usually circumstances where people are in some kind of addictive context or something that has, in any case, utterly broken them. And I do agree that the idea of how to stamp the 12 steps on congregational life is no easy or mean trick. You can't force people into that circumstances. And frankly, many people are not in circumstances that leave them with any sense of desperation. Mm-hmm. But for those who do, the news that desperation is good news is really a different thing. And when that has landed in a person's life, it changes everything.
Yeah. And it also, to me, it makes sense when I go back and look at Scripture and you see, Isaiah 6, woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips. Or Paul, why do I do that which I would not do? Over and over, you'll have these statements that to us in a therapeutic, relatively affluent Western world just look extreme, bizarre, lacking in self-esteem, something. But if you go to a 12-step meeting, those statements are real clear. Or I'll think about in the book of Acts where Peter is preaching at Pentecost, and I think it's in verse 37 where it says, and the people were cut to the heart.
Yes, right.
What should we do? And then you get to verse 42, and then you get the program, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to prayer. So that's the steps. That's the 12 steps back then. But if you don't have verse 37, you never get to verse 42. That's what opened them up. And there's a terrific book, Addiction and Virtue, by a philosopher, Kent Dunnington. And the last chapter, he writes about what can the church learn from AA. Very often, tons of pastors or folks who write, people that do what you and I do, will go to an AA meeting and then come back and ask that question, why can't the church be more like AA? There's a whole book by a guy named Stephen Hayes, and that's the title of the book, Why Can't the Church Be More Like AA? And I think the short answer is it can, as long as those of us who go to church are willing to be more like alcoholics. Right. And so what Kent says, one of the statements that he makes in this chapter is part of what we need to learn that 12-step groups understand is that the recognition and public confession of personal inadequacy is itself a spiritual achievement that needs to be ritualized and celebrated.
Yes, yes.
And again, I think historically in the church, that notion that I need grace from God even to recognize my own need from God, or, what Wesley would talk about as prevenient grace. You've got to go ahead to, and that's in an odd way. There's a really interesting lecture online by Scott Peck, and I think he got this phrase from Gerald May, addiction, the sacred disease. And at the very end of it, he talks about it just may be that God has allowed addiction in our day as a way of helping to save the human race.
Wow.
Because it opens people up to their need for God. But that notion that not just before somebody's become a Christian and then they do, and then it's hard to keep going to church and live in real-time awareness of personal inadequacy. And we just want to look good. And so it's a challenge to seek to pursue it. But I thought that if we could help churches become places where we celebrate the recognition of personal inadequacy and talk about that on a real regular basis, not just I needed him then, but now I'm strong, but no, every day. Without God, I'm a train wreck, I'm a basket case, and that's that strange thing where failure and pain and so on so often become helps in our meeting God.
Right, right. Recently, I was speaking in a congregational setting about the temptations of Jesus in Matthew, and it was interesting to me that afterward I had two very memorable conversations. One was with somebody who wanted to understand why I had decided to just remind people of all of their sins, which wasn't my understanding of what I had done. But nevertheless, that was her hearing of what I had done. And to her, clearly, it felt like it was out of context and overbearing. But then for the people that came to me otherwise, they were primarily people who were in recovery. Mm-hmm. And for them to hear the temptations of Jesus vividly described and narrated in a way to try to help us understand the depth of what's really happening in those temptation scenes was for them like, running water. It felt like somebody offering something that was just what they felt they needed, right? So two very different responses, as is true of any kind of communication event, frankly, but was certainly typified to me on that score. And I think, again, the trappings that we've created for church don't necessarily lend themselves to candor and honesty and self-confession, and they lend themselves to other things. And some of those things can be still healthy and good and viable and important, absolutely. But there is a tension there to me, especially when, as a pastor, you know that there's people that you are aware of in the congregation by name who are on a really different road of the withered hand, as you put it, not just people who happen to be sitting in a pew on a given Sunday. And their desperation, their hunger for something that would bring life to them is visceral. You can feel it, I think, as I know you can when you're preaching. You can see it and feel it unfolding in the course of that whole experience. Very powerful. John, one of the things that's really, I think, of great strength of the book is the way that in each of the 12 steps, there's really at least 3 chapters about each of those 3 steps. What this offers the reader is a really great opportunity to hear again and to hear again, because in a certain way, you're sticking on the same particular step, but the layering that goes on as you go through each of these, the kinds of stories that you tell, the way that you're trying to move from in a way, certainly just a cognitive understanding of what the step is really about in various ways, to inviting people into that deeper sense of engagement with what this is about, and then what it means to actually take the steps, and even some suggested steps that people might take as a consequence of having read that chapter. I was just curious if there's something you want to say about that structure, because
you know what? I've been talking about it a fair amount. Nobody's asked me about that. And so thank you for asking. Yeah, it was quite deliberate. Part of it is just, the co-founders of A were Bill W., man known to history as Bill W., and then Dr. Bob. And Dr. Bob's final words to Bill W. were, "Keep it simple, Bill." It's often called a simple program for complicated people.
Yes.
And again, the idea behind that is because life and death are on the line. And so I wanted to try to make it real accessible. And with this one, Mark, as an author, you always have to think a little bit about not just your audience. I write about stuff I'm interested in, so I never think a lot about, who's going to get the book, but also what's the voice and the tone. And this was a little different. It was like, I think I need to try to write this as best I can in the voice of a sponsor.
Right.
And sponsor's voice is a unique voice of love and a brutal candor. And to be able to try to unpack the steps as best I could. And then part of what I wanted to do that I was just interested in is connecting the dots between the 12 steps and Christian attempts at spiritual formation or ways of life over the centuries. And in many ways, the 12 steps seemed to me like a fabulous case study. There's the whole case study method of teaching any number of subjects. And spiritual formation is a wonderful subject. And I believe that the 12 steps is a great case study method for looking at the challenge and problems connected with spiritual formation. So just doing one little subchapter at a time, 3 for each of the steps, enables the book to get into the layers underneath the steps in a way that felt more doable to me.
Yes. And I think actually it feels like an easing into the full depth and scope of each of the 12 steps, right? You can take, in the spirit of the quotation you offered earlier about keeping it simple, each of the 3 sections has a clarity and, in that sense, a simplicity, which would be overbearing, frankly, if all of that was just simply one thing, right? Because you unpack it in such multi-layered ways, and the illustrations you use, the kind of tones, the descriptions of real stories, and of people who are experts in these areas, it has just really added a great richness to the book that at least I've not seen in other books that I've read about 12 steps. So in part, my recommendation to listeners is that this is a multi-layered approach, and it makes it even more compelling, but also even more accessible in a certain way. Whereas sometimes the 12 steps can feel like Zen, where you're sort of like, you either get it or you don't. If you don't, then off with your head. I mean, you're done with, it's not going to work for you. Whereas what you're doing is creating a pathway that's a very different approach.
Yeah, no, it was that way for me for a long time. I was interested in it a long time ago just because I've always been interested in life change, and that community was interesting to me. But the steps themselves, probably like anything else, I didn't understand or appreciate it's kind of like the tip of an iceberg. So if anyone wants to go and look through them, one of the things that you'll notice, if you pay attention to grammar, which people who are presidents of seminaries are apt to do, is that all the verbs are in the past tense.
Right.
And we admitted that we were powerless, and we came to believe, and we decided to turn over our lives. And that's a very significant thing. And the reason they're in the past tense is what happened is that, this guy, Bill W., got a knock on the door from a man named Ebby T. and told him that he had found God and stopped drinking. So Bill W. starts going to the Oxford group, which is this attempt in the 20th century to recapture what does it mean to follow Jesus. A guy named Sam Shoemaker, Calvary Episcopal, and discovers as he begins to do that, oh, by the way, he gets sobriety thrown in. And then Dr. Bill, the same thing. So for about 4 years, one person after another gets pulled into this little movement. And there is no big book, and there are no 12 steps, and there are no there's the Oxford group trying to follow Jesus.
Right.
And by the time they get about 100 people, they finally say, we can't keep this to ourselves. There are millions of people we know who are dying from alcoholism, and we have been given a pathway to freedom. We have to let them know about it. And so it's a community effort, although it's mostly Bill W. sat down and began to write this stuff out. But the significance of the past tense is it worked first and then it got codified.
Yes, yes.
And as you know, the temptation to all of us who lead churches is we're pretty smart. We read a lot of books, and we've read Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and John Mark Comer, whoever else. So we'll just go away for a weekend and then come back and bring to everybody, okay, do this much solitude, do this with your finances, read the Bible this much, spend this much, and it always has a kind of a random feel to it.
Right.
But with the 12 steps, they worked first. And then they got codified. And so I'll often find in going through them, and the longer I live with it, the more that I find it, there's bits to the language that make so much sense because it flowed out of the heaven and hell experience. There's the sheer spiritual alchemy of it that it almost feels inspired. And in the second step, came to believe. In AA, they will often just use that little phrase, one word at a time. First came. I started coming to meetings. I just came to meetings. I was a mess, but I came. I don't know why I did, but I came. And then as a result of doing that, I came too. And that's a moment of clarity. That's the prodigal son in the pig trough. What am I doing at the pig trough? He'd been at the pig trough all that time. One day, thank God, he came to himself, is the way it's often translated, and then came to believe. So that's the way it works. Came. So just start coming to meetings, and then came to, that will happen, moment of clarity, and then came to believe. And all through that, there will be a depth to the language, and not just the language, to the reality that the language points to that is kind of breathtaking and has that whiff of it that seems to lie beyond human ingenuity.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. One of the things I've often thought about that's right alongside what you're saying is that there's a difference, of course, between psychotherapy and AA. And both are valuable. Both can be incredibly influential in changing people's lives. The thing about AA, just exactly as you're saying, you take an action, you do something, and you come to an acknowledgement of something. And often in the context of therapy, you say something, you discover something.
Yes.
And then you hope that it leads to a changed behavior. But it feels like it tends to operate in almost inverse relationship between the discovery and the action. It's a little bit like what I think Anselm means when he says that we are people with faith seeking understanding. That's what's happening in a way in both models.
Yes.
But in the AA model, it's seeking understanding through action and presence and observation and community,
yes,
which then leads to an understanding of, oh my gosh, I'm even worse off than I thought. I mean, I came to the meeting thinking that things were bad, but now it's like, oh my gosh, I totally understand now how much greater the crisis is. And that my action leads me then to come to understand the greater picture of what's happening and what's really needed.
Yep. No, and that gets deeply into, again, the will and the role of action and where does grace come in, and the misconception so often that grace is opposed to taking action.
Right.
Instead of understanding, what Wesley would talk about as the means of grace. And really the 12 steps, rightly understood, are a means of grace. It's very striking to me. Again, there's so many dots to connect. it would talk about itself. The big book would describe itself from the beginning in, they don't necessarily name these as the two elements, but the two elements are, we are a fellowship and we are a program. And you have to have both things. If you have a program but not a fellowship, you try to do it on your own, you're dead. If you got a fellowship with a group of people, but there is no action to be taken, there is no program to follow, not legalistically, not at random, but something that will engage the whole person, there's no hope in that. And I was thinking, it's always been that way. So the fellowship begins with Abraham, and then the program gets clarified with Moses on Sinai and the Ten Commandments and the Pentateuch and so. And then, that's unfolding, always a work, and it's always the fellowship, and it's always it gets rediscovered with Josiah and so. And then Jesus comes along, and now he begins a new kind of fellowship with the 12 disciples and clarifies the program with the Sermon on the Mount, and that runs, and then he's crucified and resurrected. And then you get the church in Acts 2, and now there's a group of people that band together, and they are the fellowship. And then they have a program day after day. They devoted themselves. And then when the transforming power gets lost, then you have Anthony going out in the desert. And now there's a new fellowship and the rule of Benedict or so, Bonhoeffer life together. But always there has to be a fellowship and there has to be a program. And we're always, I think, at risk of either neglecting the fellowship. And, in our day, especially post-COVID, I love online technology that lets us do this, that lets me do what I do most days, but it has to point people into fellowship because individually, now they're saying in AA, I get drunk, we get sober.
Right.
So we have to have the fellowship. But the other piece of it is there has to be an actionable, grace-filled, non-random, transformational program, way of life. And that's what discipleship requires. And the 12 steps just makes that really, really clear. So yes, I think your point about there has to be action for people to be able to take is fundamental. And one of the things I'll think sometimes, I write about this, neither here nor there, I don't know that I've talked about it, but one of the ways the gospel will sometimes be expressed is the news that you're actually worse than you ever dreamed, but you're loved more than you could ever know. It's like, well, those are two good truths. But if you went to a group of drunks and said, now the bad news is you're worse off than you ever thought, but the good news is you're loved more than you ever know, there's no help for today in that.
Right.
And so there's not a gospel for this life that calls to a certain way in that. So the gospel has to be about something more than just, it's got to call for the right kind of wise action as an intrinsic part of the response.
It is just so interesting to me because you could imagine an approach to addiction that would be all about subterranean things, right? Where you have to get to the root of the X, whatever it is that's going to then be the thing that's going to unlock and release you from this. But the doing approach is an approach that's not per se subterranean. It can lead us into subterranean territory for sure. But on the other hand, just the willingness to take concrete steps will start affecting and transforming life if we're actually doing it in desperation with full honesty between ourselves, God, and the community that we're a part of, right? Working the program. And so I guess I'm wondering, in the midst of that fact, which you've wonderfully underlined, what is the value or not of thinking of addiction as a disease and alcoholism, let's say, in particular?
Yeah. And again, that's where I'm not an addiction specialist nor a philosopher. So I love to chat about this, but it's above my pay grade, and you may have much richer thoughts. Neil Plantinga, in his book, Not the Way It's Supposed to Be, A Breviary of Sin, it's a wonderful little book. And he's got a whole chapter on what he calls the tragedy of addiction. And so he says that addiction and sin are overlapping categories. And that certainly addiction can involve sin. And pretty clearly, there are some particular sins that are not caused by an addiction. And Kent's book, that book, Addiction and Virtue, is partially oriented around that question, is addiction a disease? And he actually relies very heavily on Aquinas and says, essentially in our day, because it's talked about so often as a disease, the only proof that's given that it is a disease is that the brain of an addict is different from the brain of a non-addict, that addiction causes brain changes. And one of Kent's points is, well, becoming a world-class cellist also gives you a different brain, but it doesn't mean that's an addiction. So that the proof in that regard is actually a little thin. And he says to rightly understand the nature of addiction, you have to go back to the old Latin language for it was habitus, which he says is a much deeper and much more powerful enemy than just habits as we think of them, tying your shoes or something. And I think for anybody who's interested in it, his material on that stuff is very interesting. I think the great advantage of the disease metaphor is it removes a lot of the stigma.
Right, right.
And so I think two of the great problems that we have to deal with that the disease language helps with is shame. And just that sense of I'm way worse than other people in a way that leads to despair and a cycle of rumination and self-blame and self-hatred that doesn't have any energy or life into it. So that's a problem. And then judgmentalism and superiority and pride, which are so at the root of sin. You know, I can deal with it. What's the matter with you? Why can't you deal with it? Just try harder. So both of those are so endemic or epidemic in human life. And I think that the disease metaphor helps to take some of the sting out of that. I was just thinking about this yesterday. It's so interesting that you should ask, and trying to think about right ways to say this. How do we take away destructive shame and superiority on the one hand without the loss of the understanding and value of agency on the other? And so with many, many issues, including addiction, often the idea can be, well, we used to blame people for this, but now we understand it's just the product of a social system.
Right.
And it's like, well, there are systemic issues that are normal, that are huge and that have to be addressed. And then when we shame people and when we assume moral superiority over somebody that has a problem that I don't happen to have, that's evil and it's a huge problem. And yet, and of course, part of what's really interesting in AA is on the one hand, there is a real clear message. Nobody wants to be an alcoholic. You didn't choose to be an alcoholic. This is something that happened that, so understand that you're a person that needs help. This did not happen because you're a bad person.
Right, right.
And at the same time, Bill W. writes in the book, what's our problem? Selfishness. That's our problem. So there's a deep understanding of the need to accept responsibility and take a fearless and searching inventory of what is my character and own all that stuff. And I think that we have a lot of work to do in the church around that stuff. But that's what I would say is of real value in the disease metaphor,
right,
as it addresses some real deep problems.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things that I noticed in reading the book, and I was just curious if this was true, is that when you were writing the chapters about confession to another, it felt to me like you were dwelling on that even more sensitively and persistently. It was like there was something particular that you were working out in that in a way that I didn't quite feel actually in the other chapters. I'm just curious if that was true. And in any case, in that step of confession to another person, just speak a little bit about that for those who haven't yet read the book.
Yeah, so step 5 is confess to God, ourselves, and one other person the exact nature of our wrongs. And James 5:16, confess your sins one to another, pray for each other that you might be healed. That connection of confession and healing is such an interesting one. And I think probably 3 elements to your question, which I think is a true one for me personally. One dimension of step 5 is it's incredibly concrete and embarrassing and humiliating. So the first 3 steps, admitted that we were powerless, came to believe, turned over our lives in our will, those can be a little bit abstract. They're very real, but they can be a little abstract. for me to look you in the eye and say, "No, Mark, I want to tell you about my financial life. I want to tell you about my sexual life. I want to tell you about my ambition and greed and how I've hurt my kids." And that's a very intimidating thing to do. And I think because I have experienced that in my own life, I talk in the book about, in particular, my friend Rick, who's another Fuller grad, and finally deciding I would like to have a friend before whom, as best as I can tell sincerely, I have no secrets. And that was very scary and then very liberating when I first spent a long time kind of confessing to him. And then he just said to me out of the blue, "John, I love you more right now than I've ever loved you before." It was like, I was not prepared for that. And it was incredibly powerful for me. And it's interesting in the program, folks will say it's often after people take the fifth step that the compulsion to drink begins to go away.
That's fascinating.
Because there's just something so powerful about being fully known and then experiencing that somebody loves me. And I think that's the hardest step for us to take in churches.
Uh-huh.
And there's so much power in it. So I think it's real tangible, but then my own experience of the power of it and the healing that comes along with it and the difference that it can make in other people's lives if they're willing to take that one. Yeah, that one it hits on a personal level for me in a way that's kind of unique, I think.
Right. I do have to say how much I honored, John, your own story as it is present underneath and throughout the book in a certain way, without being voyeuristic or writing in a way that made the book or what you were trying to display about you, but the fact that you were so present to every step and to the presence of a story that didn't have to be described in its specifics, but you could sense, because of the quality of your writing and the kinds of topics you were discussing, the reality behind what was being advocated by you. And I just felt like I wanted to just really acknowledge that, because I do think that allows a person that might come to this book with their own story feeling as though somehow they may or may not feel the desperation of a person who's laying in an alley drunk. That is not the nature of their desperation, but they feel desperate all the same. And somehow the way that the reality of your own pain was testified to was, I just thought, a really great strength of the book. Well, so thank you very much for that. Thank you.
And yeah, it was stuff where just having experienced pain, especially in recent years, that did not all have to be described necessarily, but it certainly informed things. And even with step 5, to write about its importance, but also don't prematurely disclose to the wrong person. And how do you go about finding the wrong person?
Right.
And the danger, for as much as those of us in the church can talk about be vulnerable and be self-disclosing, if that's done to the wrong person, that can utterly destroy a life. And I've seen that happen. And so I think, living through different facets of the steps just creates a different description of them.
Right. Well, it comes through. Maybe one question that's a little on topic, but off topic. I was really struck throughout the book by how much the fact that we inhabit a story is part of the book, right? You couldn't talk about the journey of the 12 steps without seeing it as a story. You couldn't separate out that process from a narrative of sorts. But I think there are billions of people who do not experience their life as a story. They have no narrative. They would just say of themselves, this happened, that happened, this other thing happened. It does not make a story. It's like a list of things. And because you and I live in a cultural context where personal narration of your personal story is not an infrequent experience, it's a very common one and a nurtured one, in fact. I guess I just wanted to get your thoughts now, less about addiction per se and the 12 steps only, but really this larger question of what is helpful about story? Why is it that story is such an important part of how we come to self-understanding?
Yeah, there's a book for anybody who's interested by Robert McKee, who I guess was kind of a classic seminar leader, a great script film writer in Hollywood. It's called Story. And he describes the essential elements of story. There has to be a protagonist, and there's, of course, 1,000 variations, could be multiple or so. They must have an object of desire. The spine of the story is the strength of the desire of the protagonist for that object. So if James Bond doesn't want to save the world and stop Dr. Evil, there's not much of a story there. And then there have to be barriers. There has to be conflict that are blocking that protagonist from achieving that. And it's a fabulous book and a wonderful way of thinking about what is my heart's desire? Eleanor Stump will talk about the importance of heart's desire. What is my heart's desire? And when I begin to think about my life as a story, then I have to start looking at, and that brings a kind of unity to it, for better or for worse. I'm talking now from Santa Barbara, where Nancy and I live now, and there's a cemetery. We've already bought our plots there, and we'll go there every once in a while. It's kind of goofy, but there's a little mausoleum, and they have urns of folks' bodies that have been cremated, and some of those urns are in the shape of a book. And so there'll be a name, Mark Labberton, 1968 or thereabouts, to whenever that final date is. And there's something very interesting in just looking at it and thinking, now that's the final physical remains, but there's a story there. And we all know that, but I think there's something about life, maybe our culture, maybe the fact that we don't sit around the campfire telling stories like most of our forebears have done throughout most of history. We don't memorize the genealogies that tell the story of the people from whom we came. Part of alienation and isolation and the sense of meaningless that's so pervasive, and the sense of loneliness and detachment from other people, is all of those are little indicators that's what's missing is story. And I think in a way, story is kind of the essential unit of meaning or framework of meaning for personhood. Science is a little different, but for personhood, it's story. And maybe partly because science seems to be continually more and more the privileged framework through which we think we view reality. There's just, in some ways in our day, a loss of story generally. And then we feel that in our lives, and they start to feel thin.
I've been involved in the last couple of years in a project that the Lilly Endowment is sponsoring called the National Storytelling Initiative. And the presupposition of it has been the story of the church is a negative story of spiraling downward in a variety of different ways. The Lilly Endowment, happens to have a particular bird's eye view on stories that are quite the opposite, the stories of people, communities, small, large, every kind of ethnic representation, denominational representation, theological spectrum, and wanting those stories to flourish. And I do think that, coming back to the 12 steps, that place of community and a program, when the community is as primary as it is, and where the program is actually storytelling, that's the primary program. And then you're working this larger program of the 12 steps, but the meetings themselves are storytelling encounters. You are around a campfire, hearing the stories of a person's life. And I do think part of the transformative impact of AA has been that combination, as you say so clearly and powerfully in the book. John, this has been so fun, and it's not just fun, it's actually provocative. And I found the book causing me to really think carefully about a number of the steps that I feel like I have taken, do take, but I felt a call back to them in a certain way, like 12 steps often do, right? Where we become aware of the need to repeat something again, because we're still not in the clear, as it were, and there's more work to be done, and you're a different person in a different season of your life and all of that. And I think many, many, many people will find this book of enormous value, and I certainly did, and I'm delighted that we had a chance to talk about it today and look forward to seeing how it's going to continue to be used in the future. So thank you again.
Well, it's a joy to talk with you, Mark. I love your mind and I love the way that you explore thoughts. And I don't know why, but whenever I talk with you, it always feels like a smile is just about 4 words away. And I love that part of the conversation as well. So I've learned through this. So thank you. I'm grateful.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.